Some children don't grow up slowly. They grow up all at once. Not because they wanted to, but because life quietly took their childhood away before they even understood what childhood was supposed to feel like.
You're the problem!
You can often recognize them as adults. They are the ones who seem unusually responsible, the ones who handle chaos calmly, the ones who listen more than they speak, who solve everyone's problems, who rarely ask for help. People call them mature for their age, but maturity can sometimes be another word for survival. Because when a child grows up too fast, something invisible happens inside them. Something psychologists sometimes describe as emotional acceleration, when a young mind is forced to process burdens it was never meant to carry. Imagine a small boat suddenly pushed into the middle of the ocean during a storm. That child becomes the captain overnight. They learn to read the moods in the room like weather patterns. A slammed door becomes thunder. A quiet sigh becomes a warning sign. A raised voice becomes lightning. And slowly, they stop being children. Instead of asking, "What do I want?" they begin asking, "What will keep things calm?" Instead of exploring the world, they study the emotional temperature of everyone around them. This is where something subtle begins, the formation of what psychologists call hyper-awareness. A child who grows up too fast becomes an expert observer. They notice the smallest shifts in tone, the tiniest changes in facial expressions, the quiet tension that others completely miss. To the outside world, it looks like emotional intelligence. But internally, it often feels like walking through life with an invisible alarm system that never turns off. Because when home feels unpredictable, the brain adapts. It learns that safety doesn't come from protection. It comes from anticipation. So the child becomes careful, they become helpful, they become the peacekeeper. Maybe they comforted a crying parent when they were only 8 years old. Maybe they had to stay quiet to avoid arguments. Maybe they learned that expressing their own emotions only made things worse. And slowly, something called parentification can happen. This is when a child unintentionally becomes the emotional caretaker of the adults around them. Instead of being protected, they become the protected. They become the protector. Instead of being guided, they become the one who holds everything together. And at first, it feels normal. Because children are incredibly adaptable, they assume the world they grow up in is simply the way the world works. If love comes with responsibility, they think love is supposed to feel heavy. If attention only appears when they are useful, they begin to believe their value comes from being needed. Over time, this creates something psychologists call conditional worth. The child learns a silent rule. I matter when I help. I am loved when I fix things. I am safe when everyone else is okay, and so they become strong, but not the kind of strength people celebrate. This is the quiet strength of someone who learned to swallow their emotions before anyone else could see them. They become the friend who listens for hours but rarely shares their own struggles. They become the sibling who keeps the family together. They become the adult who looks perfectly fine on the outside while carrying an invisible exhaustion inside, because growing up too fast doesn't just change behavior, it reshapes identity. The brain begins to associate peace with control, chaos with vulnerability, dependence with danger, and this leads to a strange paradox later in life. These individuals are often incredibly reliable but deeply uncomfortable being supported. They can solve problems for everyone else, but when someone asks, "Are you okay?" something inside them freezes. Because for most of their childhood, there was no space to be not okay. So they learned emotional compression, pushing their feelings down like books stuffed into an already overflowing shelf. And eventually, the shelf begins to bend. This is why many adults who grew up too fast experience something psychologists refer to as delayed emotional processing. The feelings they never had time to process as children quietly wait in the background of their adult lives. Not loudly, not dramatically, but like an echo in a large empty room. Sometimes it shows up as unexplained anxiety. Sometimes it appears as a constant sense of responsibility for things that were never theirs to carry. Sometimes it manifests as a deep, quiet loneliness, even when surrounded by people who care. Because when a child becomes the strong one too early, they often grow into adults who feel like no one truly sees the weight they've been carrying. And perhaps the most painful part is this. The world usually praises them for it. You're so mature, you're so independent, You've always been the strong one. You have always been the strong one. But those words can sometimes feel like chains disguised as compliments, because what many people don't realize is that strength built through necessity often hides a silent grief. The grief of moments that never happened, the grief of emotional needs that were quietly ignored, the grief of a childhood that moved too quickly, like a book where entire chapters were skipped, and somewhere deep inside there may still be a younger version of them. The child who never really had the chance to be a child who learned responsibility before play, silence before expression, control before curiosity, and that child is still there, waiting, not for someone to praise their strength, but for someone to finally understand why they had to become strong in the first place. Because the real question is not why these children grew up so fast. The real question is, what happens to the parts of them that never got the chance to grow at all? And the answer to that question is where things become even more complicated, because the mind has a strange way of protecting itself when childhood disappears too soon, sometimes by building invisible walls that even the person living inside them cannot fully see. And those walls quietly shape the way they experience love, trust, and connection for the rest of their lives. Because when the mind builds walls that early, they don't always disappear with age. They simply become invisible. A child who had to grow up too fast often learns one powerful lesson without realizing it. Vulnerability is risky, not because someone explicitly told them that, but because their experiences quietly proved it. When they cried, maybe no one came. When they were scared, maybe they had to handle it alone. When they needed comfort, maybe the room was already filled with someone else's problems. So the mind adapts again. Instead of asking for help, they become self-reliant. Instead of depending on others, they depend on themselves. And while independence can look like strength, sometimes it's simply the armor of someone who never felt safe enough to lean on anyone. This is why many adults who grew up too fast struggle with something that feels confusing even to them. They crave connection, yet they keep a quiet emotional distance. They care deeply about people, yet struggle to fully trust them. They give endlessly, yet feel uncomfortable receiving. It's not because they are cold. It's because somewhere in their early years they learned that needing people could lead to disappointment. So they build what psychologists sometimes call emotional self-containment, a life where they hold everything together on their own, where they solve their own problems, where they process their own pain, where they rarely let anyone see the parts of them that still feel fragile. But here is the quiet truth many people never say out loud. The child who grew up too fast was never weak. They were never too sensitive. They were simply adapting to an environment that demanded more from them than it should have. What looked like maturity was actually resilience. What looked like emotional control was actually protection. What looked like independence was actually survival. And when you begin to see it that way, something inside the story changes. Because the goal was never to erase that strength. The goal is to finally give space to the parts of yourself that were never allowed to exist, the playful part, the emotional part, the curious part, the part that once wanted to be taken care of. Healing for someone who grew up too fast doesn't mean becoming someone new. It means slowly meeting the younger version of yourself that had to hide. Sometimes it looks like learning how to say, "I'm not okay," without guilt. Sometimes it means allowing yourself to rest without feeling like you're failing someone. Sometimes it means realizing that your value was never tied to how much you could carry for others. And perhaps the most important shift of all is understanding this. You are allowed to receive the care you once gave to everyone else. Because the truth is, the child who grew up too fast often became the adult who takes care of everyone, the listener, the helper, the fixer. But even the strongest people deserve somewhere to lay down their armor, somewhere safe enough to finally exhale. And slowly, as that understanding grows, something remarkable begins to happen. The walls that once protected you no longer need to stand so tall, not because the world suddenly became perfect, but because you finally realized that your worth was never dependent on holding everything together. You were always worthy of softness. You were always worthy of patience. You were always worthy of being seen, and maybe healing doesn't happen all at once. Maybe it happens in quiet moments, in the decision to stop blaming yourself for surviving, in the courage to feel emotions you once buried, in the gentle understanding that the child inside you was simply doing the best they could with the world they were given. And if you were one of those children, the ones who had to grow up too fast, then there is something important you deserve to hear. Your strength was never your burden to carry forever. It was simply the bridge that helped you reach this moment. A moment where you can begin to redefine what life feels like when survival is no longer the only goal. A moment where you can finally choose peace over pressure, softness over armor, and self-compassion over silent endurance. Because the child you once were didn't disappear. They are still there, waiting patiently for the day you realize that growing up too fast doesn't mean you have to stay that way forever. And maybe, just maybe, the rest of your life is not about being the strong one. Maybe it's about finally learning how to be human again. And if this story felt strangely familiar, if it quietly reflected pieces of your own journey, then know this: you are not broken. You are simply someone who learned strength earlier than most, and healing begins the moment you allow yourself to understand that. If this story resonated with you, you are not alone. And perhaps somewhere out there, another soul is listening tonight, realizing for the first time that their story makes sense too. So stay curious about your own mind, stay gentle with your own heart, and if these quiet conversations about the psychology of being human speak to you, consider subscribing, because sometimes the most powerful healing begins with simply understanding ourselves a little more deeply.